You learn more about human nature from a broken expectation than from 100 promises, because promises show people who they want to be. Disappointment shows who they are when the mask no longer serves them. Most people spend their entire lives collecting promises and refusing to update their assessment of someone when the promises fail to materialize. They call this hope. They call it giving people the benefit of the doubt. They call it loyalty, or patience, or love. What it actually is, in most cases, is a refusal to see clearly, because seeing clearly requires accepting a version of events that is more painful than the comfortable fiction it would replace. This video is not about giving up on people. It is about the specific moment when accumulated evidence finally outweighs accumulated hope, and what happens to a person who allows that moment to land instead of explaining it away. What happens is not bitterness. It is the end of a very particular and very costly habit, the habit of lowering yourself to remain in proximity to people who were never going to meet you where you actually stood. Chapter 1. The difference between who people are and who they perform. Every person you have ever met exists in two simultaneous versions. There is the performed version, the self they present, the intentions they articulate, the identity they would choose for themselves if identity was simply a matter of choosing. And there is the operative version, the self that actually governs their behavior under pressure, under temptation, under the specific conditions that reveal what a person does when the cost of consistency exceeds their willingness to pay it. Most relationships are conducted almost entirely with the performed version. This is not necessarily dishonest. Most people genuinely believe their performed version is accurate because most people do not have the self-awareness to track the gap between what they intend and what they actually do under load. Your job, if you want to see clearly, is not to become a cynic who assumes everyone is lying. It is to become a careful observer who understands that the performed version is a hypothesis, not a conclusion, and that the only data capable of confirming or disconfirming the hypothesis is behavior under conditions where performance is costly to maintain. This is why disappointment is more informative than promises. A promise is performance with no cost attached yet. A broken promise is the operative self showing up to collect on a debt the performed self incurred. Chapter 2. Why you ignored the evidence for as long as you did. If the operative self is observable, and if disappointment is more reliable data than promises, the obvious question is why you spent as long as you did refusing to act on what you were already seeing. The answer is not stupidity. It is a specific psychological mechanism called motivated reasoning, the unconscious distortion of evidence evaluation in service of a conclusion you have already decided you need to be true. You needed the person to be who they presented themselves as being, because the alternative required you to confront a series of costs you were not prepared to absorb. The cost of admitting you had misjudged someone, the cost of restructuring a relationship or a routine or an identity that depended on their continued presence, the cost of grieving something that had not technically ended but had, in every functional sense, already stopped being what you believed it was. Motivated reasoning does not feel like denial from the inside. It feels like generosity, like patience, like giving someone room to be human. This is what makes it so durable. You were not failing to see the evidence. You were processing it through a filter specifically designed to produce the conclusion that allowed you to avoid the costs of clarity. The filter does not lift because the evidence improves. It lifts when the cost of continued distortion finally exceeds the cost of facing what the distortion was protecting you from. Chapter 3. The anatomy of lowering yourself. Lowering yourself is rarely a single dramatic concession. It is a gradual recalibration, conducted in small enough increments that you do not notice the cumulative distance until you are asked to imagine explaining your current position to the version of yourself that existed before the recalibration began. It begins with small adjustments to your own standards, accepting a level of effort, consideration, or respect that you would not have accepted at the outset, justified in the moment by context that seems reasonable. They are busy, they are going through something. This is not who they really are. Each adjustment is individually defensible. The aggregate is not. What you are actually doing with each incremental lowering is updating your internal model of what you deserve, based not on any objective standard, but on whatever the other person is currently willing to provide. This is a catastrophic inversion of the proper direction of information flow. Your sense of your own worth should inform what you accept. Instead, what you are currently being offered becomes the input that revises your sense of your own worth downward, match by match, until the distance between where you started and where you have ended up is substantial enough that closing it feels less like a correction and more like an identity crisis. This is the actual mechanism of lowering yourself, and it operates so gradually that most people only recognize it retrospectively, usually at the exact moment they finally see clearly. Chapter 4. Seeing clearly is not the same as becoming cruel. Before going further, a distinction needs to be made with enough precision that it cannot be misused. Seeing people clearly does not mean assuming the worst about them. It does not mean treating every person as a potential threat, every kindness as a manipulation, every inconsistency as proof of bad character. This is not clarity. It is a different, equally distorted filter, one that protects against disappointment by preemptively assuming disappointment is inevitable, which generates its own kind of safety, but at the cost of an accuracy that genuine clarity requires. Clear sight holds two things simultaneously, without collapsing them into each other: the recognition that people frequently are not who they present themselves to be, and the recognition that this is not universally true, that some people's operative self and performed self are substantially aligned, and that the task is discernment rather than blanket suspicion. The person who has achieved actual clarity is not harder to please. They are more accurate in their assessments, capable of recognizing genuine reliability when it is present, and capable of recognizing its absence without requiring extensive proof before acting on the recognition. This distinction matters because the failure to make it produces a person who mistakes hardness for wisdom, who congratulates themselves for cynicism as if it were insight, and who ends up just as disconnected from reality as the person who never learned to see clearly in the first place, simply disconnected in the opposite direction. Chapter 5. The specific moment. Disappointment becomes data. There is a threshold, different for every person and every relationship, at which a disappointment stops being processed as an isolated incident and starts being processed as a data point in a pattern. Before this threshold, each disappointment is evaluated in isolation, stripped of its context within a longer history, and judged charitably because isolated incidents are easy to excuse. After this threshold, the same disappointment is evaluated against everything that preceded it, and the charitable explanation that worked the first 3 times becomes structurally incapable of accounting for the 4th, the 5th, the 10th. What causes the shift is rarely a single dramatic event. It is usually the accumulation of enough individually excusable incidents that the excusing itself starts to feel less like generosity and more like a performance you are conducting for your own benefit to avoid a conclusion that the evidence has already quietly reached. When this threshold is crossed, something changes in how you process new information about the person. You stop asking, "What could explain this?" and start asking, "What does this confirm?" This is not bitterness, it is pattern recognition, finally being permitted to operate without the interference of motivated reasoning. And once it operates, it does not require additional evidence to reach a conclusion. It requires only the willingness to apply the conclusion the existing evidence already supports. Chapter 6. Why other people resist your newly clear sight. The people who benefited from your previous willingness to lower yourself will not respond well to its withdrawal. This is predictable, and understanding why removes the sting of surprise that usually accompanies it. From their perspective, nothing has changed about their own behavior. They have simply continued operating as they always did. What has changed is your tolerance for it, and because they experienced your previous tolerance as the baseline condition of the relationship, your recalibration registers to them not as a correction, but as a betrayal. You will be told that you have changed, that you have become cold, that you used to be more understanding, more patient, easier to be around. Examine this feedback carefully because it is data about the relationship, not data about you. What they are describing as a positive quality you have lost is, in nearly every case, your previous willingness to accept less than you were owed. The discomfort they are expressing is not concern for your well-being. It is the discomfort of someone who has lost access to a resource they had not realized was conditional. This does not mean every accusation of coldness is unfounded. Some people do overcorrect, do become genuinely harsh in ways that exceed what clarity requires. But the specific accusation of having become harder to please when it follows directly from your decision to stop accepting less than you deserve is rarely an accurate description. It is a request, often unconscious, to restore the previous arrangement. Chapter 7. The role of self-respect in accurate perception. There is a counterintuitive relationship between self-respect and the ability to see other people clearly, and it runs in the opposite direction from how most people assume it operates. The common assumption is that clear sight produces self-respect, that once you see someone's true character, you naturally stop tolerating their treatment of you. This is backward. In practice, self-respect is frequently the precondition for clear sight, not its consequence. A person with insufficient self-respect has a structural incentive to distort their perception of others, because accurate perception would require acknowledging a level of mistreatment that contradicts a deeper, unexamined belief that they do not deserve better. The distortion is not a failure of intelligence. It is a defense of a self-concept that cannot yet tolerate the implications of accurate observation. This is why people with low self-respect are so frequently described by themselves and others as poor judges of character, not because their perceptual abilities are actually impaired, but because their perceptual conclusions are filtered through a prior commitment to a self-concept that requires certain conclusions to be unavailable. Building self-respect, then, is not a reward that arrives after you finally see clearly. It is frequently the work that has to happen first, because without it, every piece of clarifying evidence will continue to be processed through a filter designed to protect a self-concept that cannot yet survive what the evidence implies. Chapter 8. What you lose when you stop lowering yourself. Honesty requires naming the actual cost of this transition, because most accounts of this process skip directly to its benefits and treat the costs as minor inconveniences on the way to a better life. They are not minor. When you stop lowering yourself, you lose access to relationships that were sustained specifically by your willingness to accept less than you deserved. Some of these relationships will end entirely because the other person's investment was contingent on your continued accommodation and has no mechanism for surviving its withdrawal. Others will not end, but will become noticeably smaller, less frequent, less warm, more transactional, because the relationship's previous depth was in part a function of how much you were willing to give without requiring reciprocity. You will, in the early period of this transition, frequently be alone in circumstances where you previously had company, because the company was conditional on terms you are no longer willing to meet. This loneliness is real and should not be minimized or reframed as secretly positive. What can be said honestly is that the company you are losing was never the company of people who saw you accurately and chose you anyway. It was the company of people who saw an arrangement that benefited them and had no particular incentive to examine it further. Losing that company is a real loss. It is also, on the specific terms this script is concerned with, an accurate loss, the removal of relationships that were never what they appeared to be, rather than the removal of something that was actually serving you. Chapter 9. The people who remain when you stop lowering yourself. Some relationships do not just survive this transition, they improve in ways that are immediately noticeable to anyone paying attention. These are the relationships where the other person's investment in you was never contingent on your willingness to accept less than you deserved, which means your recalibration removes friction rather than creating it. The other person did not need you to lower yourself. They were not benefiting from the arrangement in any way that required your diminishment. When you raise your standard, they do not need to be coerced into meeting it, because they were already operating at or near that standard without requiring your accommodation to do so. These relationships are easy to misidentify in advance because the same surface-level warmth that characterizes a genuinely reciprocal relationship can also characterize one that depends on your continued lowering of yourself. The only way to distinguish them is the test this entire process constitutes. What happens when you stop? The relationships that improve, or at minimum remain stable, when you stop lowering yourself are the relationships that were never extracting anything from your diminishment in the first place. They were waiting, in effect, for you to stop offering something they did not actually require. Recognizing these relationships, once the test has been run, is one of the few unambiguously positive outcomes available in this entire process. Chapter 10. The internal architecture of not lowering yourself. Once the perceptual shift has occurred, once you have stopped distorting your evaluation of other people to protect a self-concept that required their good intentions to be true, a structural change occurs in how you operate that extends well beyond any single relationship. You begin to evaluate new people against the standard your accurate perception has established, rather than against the lowered standard your previous distortions had normalized. This produces a faster and more accurate filtering process. You notice the early signals of a gap between someone's performed self and their operative self more quickly, because you are no longer motivated to overlook them. You require less time and less accumulated disappointment before drawing conclusions, because the conclusions you draw are no longer being filtered through a need for the person to be other than what the evidence indicates. This does not make you harder to connect with, despite what the people benefiting from your previous distortions may have told you. It makes you more efficient, capable of identifying genuine compatibility and genuine reliability faster, because you are not spending the early stages of a relationship managing your own resistance to accurate information. This efficiency is one of the least discussed benefits of this entire process. The energy that was previously spent maintaining distorted perceptions of people who did not deserve them becomes available for the much smaller and much more valuable task of accurately perceiving the people who do. Chapter 11. Why this cannot be taught, only earned. There is a temptation, faced with everything described in this script, to attempt a shortcut, to adopt the conclusions of clear sight without doing the underlying work that makes clear sight possible. This does not function. A person who decides intellectually that they should stop lowering themselves without having done the prior work of building the self-respect that makes accurate perception tolerable typically produces a brittle and performative version of the standard rather than a genuine one. They become harsh in ways that are not actually rooted in accurate assessment, because they are applying a rule rather than operating from an internal state that generates the rule naturally. This is identifiable to anyone paying close attention, including, eventually, to the person themselves, because the performance requires constant maintenance in a way that genuine clarity does not. Genuine clear sight, once established, does not require effort to sustain. You do not have to remind yourself not to lower your standards, because the distortion that previously required you to lower them has been resolved rather than suppressed. This is the difference between a person who has done the work and a person who has adopted its vocabulary, and it is a difference that becomes visible under exactly the conditions this entire script has been describing. The conditions in which performance is costly to maintain, and only the operative self remains standing. Latention closing, the cold inventory. Here is the inventory, taken without sentiment. Every time you excused a broken promise, you were collecting information you had decided not to use. Every time you lowered yourself to remain in proximity to someone who was not meeting you where you stood, you were revising your sense of your own worth downward based on an external input that had no legitimate authority to revise it. Every disappointment you absorbed without updating your assessment of the person responsible for it was, in a precise sense, a transfer of power from you, who held the accurate information, to them, who benefited from your refusal to act on it. Seeing clearly does not retroactively undo any of this. It does not return the time, the accommodation, or the diminished version of yourself that the previous arrangement required. What it does is stop the transfer from continuing. The people who remain, after you stop lowering yourself, will tell you a story about who you used to be and who you have become, and the story will not be flattering, because flattering you was never the point of the previous arrangement, and there is no reason it would become the point now. You are not obligated to accept their account of the change. You were there for all of it, with a precision that no one else's narrative can override, exactly what the broken promises showed you, and exactly how long you spent refusing to believe what you were already seeing. That refusal has ended. What replaces it is not cruelty, and it is not warmth. It is simply an accurate accounting of who has been showing up, and a refusal going forward to subsidize the gap between who anyone claims to be and who they have already demonstrated themselves to be when the cost of consistency was actually required of them.